in an isolated village nestled among mountains. A secret meeting took place with no media cameras present and no intelligence services tracking. Veladors of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goita, and Abdourahamane Tiani gathered in complete isolation from the world for 3 days. By the time Western intelligence agencies discover at this meeting had occurred a month later, the foundations of the new African alliance had already been laid. The village of Timbuktu existed on new official maps, situated in a Tivoli where the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger converged. It had served for centuries as a meeting place for Tuareg nomads, neutral ground where tribal disputes were resolved and trading partnerships established. The villagers, descendants of these nomadic traditions, maintained their isolation indelibly, having learned through generations that visibility to the outside world rarely brought benefits to their community. When 3 unmarked helicopters descended into the valley at dawn on a cool November morning, the village elders were waiting. They had received word through ancient communication networks that still functioned effectively, despite or perhaps because of their independence from modern technology. The meeting had been arranged through trusted intermediaries, using protocol established long before colonial borders had been drawn across the Sahel. From the first helicopter emerged Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who had risen to power in Burkina Faso, promising to reclaim his nation's resources and security from foreign control. From the second stepped Assimi Goita. The Malian Special Forces Colonel's government had expelled French military forces after decades of their presence, had failed to resolve the country's security challenges. The third helicopter brought Abdourahamane Tiani, Niger's recently established leader, who had similarly broken ties with Western military partnerships. Each leader was accompanied by only 2 aides. No security details, no communications posts, no diplomatic staff. This meeting would have no official record, no press releases, no diplomatic communiques. What would transpire over the next 3 days would reshape the geopolitical landscape of West Africa without any outside power having the opportunity to intervene. The absence of these 3 leaders from public view did not go unnoticed in Western capitals. Their simultaneous personal retreats, the official explanation provided by their respective governments, trigger red alerts in intelligence agencies. From Washington to Paris to Beijing, satellite resources were redirected to search their territories. Communication networks were monitored for unusual patterns. Assets within their governments were activated to discover their whereabouts. But Timbuktu's isolation proved effective. No electronic signals emanated from the village. No satellite could distinguish leaders meeting from the normal activities of a remote settlement. Acknowledged that 3 of the most significant West African leaders where a meeting in secret existed only in the minds of those directly involved. Inside of village's central meeting structure, a circular building constructed of local stone with a thatched roof designed to maintain cool temperatures even in the Sahel's harsh climate. The 3 leaders sat around a simple wooden table. There, no flags, no official seals, no trappings of state power. Here they were simply 3 men representing nations with shared histories and challenges. "Gentlemen," began Traoré at 34, the youngest of the 3, but the one who had initiated this unprecedented greeting. "We meet as equals, as Africans, and as leaders facing the same fundamental challenge. How to secure a true independence for our nations and prosperity for our people when these systems of global power are designated specifically to prevent both. Go not in agreement. Mali has experienced this reality directly. When we demanded the departure of French forces that had operated in our territory for a decade without resolving our security situation, we faced immediate economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and thinly veiled threats of intervention. Niger's experience has been identical," added Tiani. "The moment we asserted control over our uranium resources and questioned the value of Western military presence. We were transformed overnight from strategic partners to rogues that attain their diplomatic language. For the first hours, the discussion focused on shared experiences. The similar patterns of response from Western powers when African nations attempted to chart independent courses. The economic pressure applied through international fiscal institutions. The support for opposition groups and potential coup plotters. The information operations depicting these leaders as autocrats' woes removal would somehow benefit their populations. But as the sun reached its zenith above the village, the conversation shifted from shared grievances to strategic possibilities. What had begun as a meeting to coordinate individual, national approaches evolved into something more fundamental: the conceptual framework for a new type of regional alliance. Our individual nations lacked the scale to resist external pressure effectively. Observed truer, unfolding a map of the region, but collectively we control territory larger than Western Europe with strategic resources the global economy cannot function without. Their sources were indeed substantial. Burkina Faso's gold reserves, Mali's vast deposits of gold, uranium, and rare earth elements, Niger's uranium, essential for nuclear energy production. Together, these nations control a natural wealth that major powers depended upon. Wealth that had been extracted for centuries with minimal benefit to local populations. What I am proposing, continued true, is not merely coordination, but integration, not a traditional alliance based on military cooperation, but a new economic and resource entity that fundamentally alters our relationship with external powers. As night fell over the village, illuminated only by lanterns that cast long shadows across the meeting chamber, the outline of this new entity began to take shape. They called it simply the Sahel Confederation, a structure that will to integrate their resource management, create shared financial mechanisms independent of former colonial systems, and establish collective security arrangements. The scant day of discussions focused on the practical implementation of this vision. The leaders and their aides, specialists in economics, security, and diplomacy, worked through the technical details of what would become the most significant thing of African sovereignty since its independence movements of the 1960s. The economic framework they developed had centered on a revolutionary approach to resource management. Rather than merely nationalizing extraction operations, a strategy that had historically prompted intervention from former colonial powers, they would create a sophisticated shared ownership model. Foreign companies could still participate in resource development but under strictly controlled terms through tenured primary benefits flowed to local economies. More radically, they designate a new currency system, the Sahel franc, backed by the collective mineral wealth of the three nations. Unlike the CFA franc that had kept former French colonies in a state of monetary dependency, this new currency would be controlled entirely by the Confederation with no external oversight or approval requirements. The currency question is fundamental, explained Traorré's economic advisor, Dr. Aminata Sankara. As long as our economies operate with currency as controlled by former colonial powers, true independence remains impossible. Financial sovereignty is the foundation of all other forms of sovereignty. The security arrangements were equally innovative. Rather than creating a traditional military alliance that might trigger direct intervention from global powers, they established a distributed security network. Each nation would maintain its own military forces, but coordinate closely through integrated human structures. More importantly, they would share intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities, creating a collective shield against the keyword operations that had destabilized Celt's African governments. By that third day, as the framework of the Confederation took shape, the discussion turned to the most delicate question: how to implement such a transformative return without triggering immediate intervention from the powers whose influence it would diminish. The moment our intentions become known, caution deny, you will face unprecedented drees. economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, possibly military threats. We must be prepared for each stage of response. This recognition led to perhaps the most sophisticated element of their plan, a phased implementation designed to establish observable facts on the ground before external powers could effectively respond. The Confederation would begin functioning through non-public mechanisms while publicly maintaining appearance of normal bilateral relations. We create the mechanism integration first, Traoré explained, establishing the practical reality of for cooperation before making any formal declarations. By the time the Confederation is officially announced, it will already be functioning too effectively to be easily dismantled. As sun set on the third day, the three leaders ceremonially signed what would later be known as the Timbuktu Accords, a document that, for security reasons, existed in only 310 copies, one held by each leader. There were no digital versions that could be necessitated, no electronic traces that could be detected by the sophisticated external systems monitoring their countries. What we have created here, said Goa, as they prepared to depart, is not merely an agreement between governments. It is a new model of African sovereignty, one based not on artificial borders imposed by colonial powers, but on the shared interests and heritage of our peoples. The helicopters departed as they had arrived before dawn. Following different routes back to their respective territories, the leaders resumed their official duties as if returning from routine retreats, giving no indication of the momentous agreement they had forged. The village of Timbuktu returned to its quiet existence, its role in history known only to its inhabitants. For the next month, there were no public signals of the transformation underway. Western intelligence agencies, having noted the simultaneous absences, found nothing concrete to confirm their suspicions of coordination. Economic and diplomatic relations continued normally on the surface. But beneath this appearance of normality, the mechanisms of Sahel Confederation began to take form. Financial channels were established, bypassing traditional banking systems. Resource inventories were shared between governments, security protocols were harmonized. Each step was implemented through trusted networks, leaving minimal evidence of the integration underway. The first public indication that something fundamental had changed came 6 weeks after the Timbuktu meeting, when the three nations simulating lead announced new regulations for foreign mining operations, presented as independent national policies. The regulations were identical, requiring increased local ownership, mandating domestic processing of raw materials, and establishing sovereign wealth funds to manage resource revenues. The coordinature of these announcements triggered immediate concern in Western capitals. Emergency meetings were convened in Paris, where the potential implications for French resource companies were particularly alarming. In Washington, intelligence analysts began identifying patterns of coordination between the three nations that had previously escaped notice. This level of policy alignment suggests a degree of integration we haven't observed before, noted a classified assessment from the U.S. State Department that later leaked to international media. These are not coincidental parallel developments, but appear to reflect a coherent shared strategy. The Western response followed predictable patterns. Financial institutions began raising concerns about investment climate deterioration. The three nations' international media published articles questioning the democratic legitimacy of their governments. Diplomatic pressure was applied through traditional channels, with not-so-subtle reminders of the development aid and security partnerships that could be jeopardized, but the Sahel Confederation had anticipated these measures. The economic pressure that might have been devastating to individual nations was manifest across their integrated systems. The security threats that had historically made leaders vulnerable were countered by their collective intelligence capabilities. The diplomatic isolation that had forced previous African governments to backtrack on resource Sovereignty was offset by new partnerships they were already developing with emerging powers. 3 months after the Timbuktu meeting, this Western pressure intensified. Without achieving its desired effect, Ibrahim Traoré addressed his nation in a televised broadcast that was simultaneously aired in Mali and Niger. The first public acknowledgement of the new level of coordination between their governments. For too long, he told his citizens, our nations have been treated not as truly sovereign states, but as resource territories to be exploited. For too long, we have been told that our development depends on following modèles descended by those who have historical benefit from our underdevelopment. For too long, we have negotiated as individual nations from positions of weakness against unified global powers without explicitly naming the Sahel Confederation. That formal announcement would come later when the integration was more advanced. He outlined a vision of regional cooperation that would transform our relationship with the world from one of dependency to one of partnership between equals. The response from citizens across all 3 nations was overwhelmingly positive. Despite the economic challenges created by Western pressure, populations that had seen minimal benefits from decades of foreign-controlled resource extraction embraced the promise of genuine sovereignty. Public rallies in support of the new approach filled city squares from Mogadishu to Bamako to Niamey. This popular support represented perhaps the most significant miscalculation by those opposing the Confederation. Western policy had long been based on the assumption that economic pressure would translate into popular dissatisfaction with governments that challenge external control. But across the Sahel, populations that had experienced generations of poverty, despite their nation's natural wealth, were willing to endure temporary hardships for the promise of fundamental change. They fundamentally misunderstand our people. Traoré told Goita and Tiani during a secure video conference 6 months after their meeting. They believe Africans will sacrifice sovereignty for short-term economic relief because their entire colonial history has been premised on that assumption, but the terror is ending. As the first anniversary of the Timbuktu meeting approached, the infrastructure of integration had progressed far beyond what most external observers realized. The 3 nations had established a common resource development agency that coordinates their approach to foreign investors. They had created financial clearing mechanisms that reduced their dependency in Western banking systems. They had integrated their security operations to effectively address regional threats that individual nations had struggled to contain. Significantly, they had boosted the technical preparations for the Sahel franc, a currency that would fundamentally alter their economic relations with former colonial powers. Backed by their combined mineral reserves and managed through distributed systems resistant to external pressure, this new currency represented the most direct challenge yet to the financialisms that had maintained economic control after formal colonization ended. 1 year after the 3 leaders had met in that isolated village, they gathered again, this time not in secret, but at a formal summit in Ouagadougou. Before he assembled diplomats from across Africa and beyond, they signed the public version of what had begun with the Timbuktu Accords, the formal treaty establishing the Sahel Confederation. Today, declared Ibrahim Traoré at this signing ceremony, we take a historic step toward fulfilling the true promise of independence, not isolation, but integration, not rejection of the world, but engagement with it on terms that respect our sovereignty and serve our people's interests. The global reaction was mixed. Western governments expressed concern about regional stability while opting to maintain dialogue with a new entity that controlled resources too strategic to ignore. Emerging powers saw opportunity in this reconfiguration of influence in resourceric. West Africa, other African nations watch closely, considering whether this new model of regional sovereignty might be applicable to their own circumstances. What none could deny was that the geopolitical landscape had been fundamentally altered. what had begun in that isolated village. Three leaders, meeting without fanfare or publicity, had initiated a transformation that challenged decades-soft post-colonial relationships and created new possibilities for African agency in the global system. For Ibrahim Traoré, who had envisioned this approach and convinced his counterparts of its viability, the Confederation represented fulfillment of the promise he had made when assuming leadership that Burkina Faso's resources would benefit its people rather than enriching distant elders. By recognizing that this goal could only be achieved through regional integration, he had initiated a process that transcended national boundaries and traditional concepts of sovereignty. The Sahel Confederation was not without challenges. Integrating nations with different colonial histories, linguistic traditions, and governance systems required constant negotiation and compromise. External powers continued attempting to undermine arrangement through economic pressure, political interference, and information operations. The practical implementation of shared resource management and financial systems encountered technical obstacles that demanded innovative solutions. Yet with each challenge overcome, the Confederation's resilience increased. The economic benefits of coordinators development began flowing to populations that had seen little advantage from their countries' natural wealth under previous arrangements. These security improvements resulting from integrated operations reduced the threat from non-state armed groups that had destabilized the region for years. The diplomatic leverage gained through collective negotiation transformed relations with external partners 2 years after the secret meeting in Timbuktu, as the Sahel Confederation celebrated its first anniversary as a formal entity. Ibrahim Traoré addressed a graduating class of students from the newly established Confederation University in Ouagadougou. These young people from across the 3 member nations represented the future the Confederation had been created to secure. What began in secrecy now continues in the open. He told them, what was conceived by 3 leaders now belongs to 30 million citizens. The path of genuine sovereignty is never easy. Powerful interests will always resist redistribution of power and resources. But when we act together, guided by a vision of dignity and development that serves our people, even the most entrenched systems can be transformed. As he spoke, negotiations were already underway with additional West African nations considering members in the Confederation. The model of regional integration, focused on resource sovereignty, had demonstrated its viability, creating a template that their parts of the continent were increasingly interested in adapting to their own circumstances. The village of Timbuktu remained as it had always been, remote, self-sufficient, largely invisible to the outside world. Few diplomats, economists, and security-analysts now studying the Sahel Confederation knew of its role in birthing this new approach to African sovereignty. The village elders preferred it that way, understanding from centuries of experience that true power often works most effectively in the gaze of those who would oppose it. For the citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the full history of how their nations had been transformed remained partially obscured. They knew their leaders had created something unprecedented, a structure of cooperation that was steadily improving their lives after generations of extracted wealth had produced minimal benefit. They celebrated the visible symbols of this new approach: the joint resource development projects, the Confederation institutions taking shape in their capitals, the new currency that would soon replace those imposed during the colonial era. What most did not know was how it had all begun with 3 leaders meeting in an isolated village away from surveillance and interference to imagine a different future for their nations and peoples. A future based not on the artificial borders and extractive relationships distilled by colonial powers, but on shared interests and integrated capacity of neighboring nations with common challenges and aspirations. Ibrahim Traoré had understood that so much transformations could only begin beyond the observation of those invested in preventing them. by creating the space for three leaders to reimagine the foundations of sovereignty and cooperation. K had initiated a process that would eventually alter not just hair nations, but potentially the entire post-colonial relationship between Africa and global powers. The secret meeting that Western intelligence service discovered only after it had already achieved its purpose represented more than a tactical success in evading surveillance. It demonstrated a profound strategic insight that African leaders needed to establish their own frameworks for cooperation before engaging with external powers rather than attempt to reform relationships designated specifically to maintain dependency. 3 years after the Timbuktu meeting, as the Sahel Confederation continued expanding both its membership and its functions, Ibrahim Traoré met with a small group of senior advisors to reflect on what had been achieved and what challenge reigned. "We have created the foundation," he told them, "but the structure that will ultimately be built upon, it may take generations to complete. True sovereignty, economic, political, security, cultural, is not achieved through declarations or agreements. It emerges through the patient construction of systems that serve our people's interests rather than extracting our wealth for others' benefit." One of his advisors, a veteran diplomat who had served previous governance, asked the question that many still pondered: why did it succeed? So many previous attempts at regional integration have faltered. What made this different? Traoré considered the question carefully before responding. Previous efforts began with public declarations and formal structures, giving opposing interests the opportunity to undermine them before they could establish momentum. We reversed that approach, creating functional integration first, demonstrating its benefits, and only then formalizing what was already working in practice. He paused, then added, "But more fundamentally, we succeeded because ZU addressed the central question that previous integration efforts avoided: who controls our resources and for whose benefit are they developed? By placing resource sovereignty at the center of our approach, we created a framework with immediate tangible benefits for our peoples, benefits significant enough to withstand the pressure applied by those opposed to our independence." As the meeting concluded, Traoré returned to his office where a simple framed photograph stood on his desk. It showed 3 leaders sitting around a wooden table in a circular stone building. It's a lively visual record of the Timbuktu meeting taken by one of the village elders and given to him as a reminder of that pivotal moment. What had begun as a secret gathering of 3 leaders determined to chart a different course for their nations had evolved into something that was steadily reshaping the economic and political landscape of West Africa. The Sahel Confederation, noted as both a practical mechanism for regional cooperation and a powerful symbol of African agency in a global system historically designed to limit it. For Ibrahim Traoré, who had initiated the process that led to this transformation, the journey from that isolated village to the expanding confederation represented the fulfillment of the promise that had brought him to leadership, that their sources beneath African soil would finally genuinely serve the development and dignity of African peoples. The secret meeting that Western intelligence desired to prevent had achieved precisely what its participants had intended, creating a new reality too firmly established to be easily undone, a model of integration based not on external designs, but on the shared aspirations of neighboring nations with common histories and challenges. In diplomatic circles, policy papers, and academic analyses, experts continue debating the implications of the Sahel Confederation and the precedent it established for resourceric region historically subject to external control, but for the citizens of its member nations, who were beginning to experience the concrete benefits of genuine resource sovereignty. The theoretical debates were less significant than the practical improvements in their daily lives. 3 leaders had met in secret, away from the observation of powers invested in maintaining the status quo. From that meeting had emerged a new approach to African sovereignty and cooperation. One that began with the fundamental question of who should benefit from Africa's vast natural wealth and construct it. Systems designed to ensure that the answer finally included the African people's toham, those resources rightfully belong.